Welcome to my channel today. I'm diving into the story of a man captured by the Comanche, one of the most formidable Native American tribes to dominate the American frontier. Our tale centers on Nelson Lee, who was captured in 1855 though. His captivity stretched for 3 harrowing years, ending in 1858. He lived to recount the experience in a book titled 3 Years Among the Comanches, where he revealed the brutal realities of his time among this fearsome tribe. In the 1850s, the Great Plains were a landscape of conflict and survival. Native American raids on frontier settlements were not uncommon, especially in areas stretching from present-day Kansas southward to western Texas and New Mexico. Nelson Lee, our protagonist, was a man of adventure by his late 40s. He had already experienced a great deal. He joined the Navy at a young age, though his naval experience did little to prepare him for what was to come on land. Later, Lee enlisted with the Texas Rangers and fought in the Mexican War, which ended in 1847. Afterward, he settled near Corpus Christi, Texas, to trade in cattle and capture wild horses. The Comanche captured Lee close to Corpus Christi. Known as fierce nomadic horse warriors, the Comanche were unlike many other Native American tribes. Before horses arrived in the Americas via the Spanish in the 1500s, the Comanche were a relatively small group, often pushed aside by stronger neighboring tribes. They had few cultural artifacts, no permanent dwellings, limited religious practices, and little in the way of established mythology outside of a reverence for the Great Spirit. However, the introduction of horses in the 1600s, eventually adopted by tribes such as the Apache and later the Comanche, transformed these once marginalized people into an unstoppable force on the plains. The Comanche didn't just adopt horses, they mastered them, making them an essential part of their culture and warfare tactics. By the 1800s, the Comanche were a dominant power in the American Southwest, using horses to cover vast distances quickly and conduct raids that struck terror into settlers' hearts. Their raids involved stealing horses and attacking travelers with devastating swiftness, often leaving little time for warning. Lee and his friend William Aiken planned to drive a herd of mules from East Texas near Corpus Christi to a place in California they referred to as Madame Ross. Lee's description of Madre Moros doesn't quite match any known location on today's maps, but some speculate they may have been aiming for a region in Baja California. However, their journey was ill-fated from the start, as they ventured right through the heart of Comanche territory, a fact they seemed to underestimate despite maps of the era explicitly marking it as Comanche land. Lee and Akins, with a crew of hired men and a supply of mules, set out in March 1855. Lee, a disciplined man, even purchased a new pocket watch with an alarm to ensure that the caravan stayed on schedule. Every morning at precisely 3 a.m., he would wake the group to keep them moving westward. They followed the Rio Grande, taking advantage of the grass there for the mules. In early April, they decided to rest just southwest of El Paso, where they believed they'd be safe by posting sentries overnight. But on the night of April 2nd, an eerie silence was broken by the terrifying sounds of a raid. Despite the sentries, there was no warning. As screams pierced the night, Lee saw shadowy figures, Comanche warriors painted for battle, moving through the camp in the chaos. He reached for his gun, but was quickly lassoed, tackled, and bound by the warriors, who moved with deadly precision through the camp, leaving only 4 men alive: Nelson Lee, William Akins, and 2 other hired hands, Thomas Martin and John Stewart. Stripped of their clothes, the survivors were forced into Comanche garb, buckskin leggings, and hunting shirts. The Comanche, rummaging through Lee's belongings, discovered his pocket watch, which went off unexpectedly, catching them by surprise. Fascinated by this magic device, the Comanche allowed Lee to demonstrate it again, interpreting it as a supernatural object connected to the Great Spirit. This simple watch may have saved his life, as the Comanche seemed to view it, and possibly him, with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. As dawn broke, Lee saw the horrifying aftermath of the raid. Bodies of the settlers were brutally mutilated, a heart-wrenching sight that haunted him. Some corpses were scalped, others had limbs severed, and the bodies were desecrated in gruesome ways. The scalps were taken as trophies, hanging from the belts of the Comanche warriors. This terror was only the beginning for Lee and his companions. The Comanche employed psychological warfare to keep their captives terrified, pretending to scalp them by grabbing their hair and making feints with knives. They also covered the men's faces with deer skins, poking small breathing holes, then tied them to mules with their hands bound behind their backs and ankles tied to the saddle. Blindfolded and unable to control the mules, Lee endured frequent falls as the mules trotted along, sometimes crashing into branches. The Comanche seemed to delight in the spectacle, as Lee described his somersaults, as a form of entertainment for the tribe. He could gauge his proximity to obstacles by the laughter that erupted each time he was thrown from his mount. Even their feeding was cruel, with chunks of boiling horse meat tossed at them, sometimes burning their skin. The Comanche found twisted amusement in watching the captives' discomfort, a chilling reminder of their captors' power. At night the captives were bound, in a manner that prevented even the slightest movement. Forced to lie flat on their backs, their limbs were tied to stakes driven into the ground, as wide apart as possible. Their necks were then restrained by buffalo hide strips, fastened to stakes on either side, effectively immobilizing them. In these conditions, they barely slept, with every night blending into a cycle of exhaustion, fear, and discomfort that continued for days. As they journeyed toward a large Comanche village, Lee estimated the settlement to contain hundreds of tents and around 500 Comanche. Though these numbers might be exaggerated, Lee's tale offers a chilling window into the brutal yet complex world of the Comanche, a people whose power on horseback and penchant for psychological warfare made them some of the most feared warriors in North America. Through his trials, Lee gives a rare, first-hand account of life among a group that balanced fierce warrior culture with its own unique sense of humor and mystique, leaving an indelible mark on the annals of the American frontier. His name was Big Wolf, a commanding name really, and one that stands out among other Comanche names from the accounts. Nelson Lee was soon escorted into the presence of Big Wolf, who had already heard about the curious pocket watch and wanted to witness its magic for himself. With a mixture of boldness and cunning, Lee refused to demonstrate the watch's alarm, claiming that doing so would risk catastrophic consequences. Though risky, it was a calculated move. Lee pointed to the sky and solemnly warned that the world would suffer if he triggered it now. Big Wolf seemed both disappointed and skeptical, but didn't press further, giving Lee a reprieve. However brief, soon after, Lee was taken about a quarter of a mile outside the village, where many Comanche warriors had gathered, and to his dismay he saw his fellow captives, Akins, Martin, and Stewart, already there. They were stripped bare, hands bound high above their heads to tall stakes embedded in the ground. Martin and Stewart were staked side by side, while Akins was set about 10 feet in front of them, facing them across a small clearing. Lee himself was stripped and fastened similarly, directly across from Akins. What followed was a chilling ceremony, one that would scar Lee deeply. Big Wolf watched from a position of authority as warriors formed a line, each holding a tomahawk or knife, while others carried flint-tipped spears. In a grim procession, they circled Martin and Stewart, who, though still alive, would soon endure gruesome mutilations. Two Comanche peeled away from the procession, knives flashing, and scalped the men. Though the scalp area was small, about the size of a silver dollar, as Lee described, but the blood was flowing heavily, the pain unbearable oddly. The warriors spared Lee and Akins for now, passing by them in silence. As the warriors circled back to Martin and Stewart, they ramped up their ferocity, slashing long cuts across their bodies with spears, until the men were a tangled mess of wounds and blood. Lee, horrified, later wrote they persisted in this hellish work until every inch of the bodies was hacked and covered in clotted blood. It was an experience so visceral that Lee would have preferred death over enduring such a fate. S.E. Gwyn's Empire of the Summer Moon notes that not only did the Comanche inflict such pain, but they seemed to relish it, finding joy in the terror they caused, a facet of their culture that was both integral and accepted. After an initial round of this nightmarish ritual, the Comanche paused for what could only be described as an intermission. They smoked, laughed, and pointed at their captives, taunting Martin for his prayers, while Stewart stayed silent. When the ritual resumed, two Comanche warriors took up a war dance. Circling ever closer to Martin and Stuart, Lee observed with dread finally. They reached the victims, danced before them for some time, then drew their hatchets suddenly and sent the bright blades crashing through their skulls. The bodies of his friends were unceremoniously cut down and discarded on the ground. Remarkably, Lee and Akins were spared, bound once more and returned to camp unharmed, yet witnessing his friends' brutal deaths haunted Lee, sparking a hatred for the Comanche that would last the rest of his life. Though he'd endured captivity, blindfolds, and the humiliation of being tied to a horse, this act, the deliberate torture and killing of his friends, was a line that had been crossed. Desperate to avoid his own torture, Lee even attempted what could be called a form of suicide, attacking the Comanche to provoke a swift end. However, the warriors merely restrained him, mocking his effort with laughter. Both he and Akins returned to the camp, though they were soon separated for weeks. When they finally met again, Akins, who would soon be sent to another camp, shared some parting advice. He urged Lee to cooperate and make himself useful. He also reminded Lee of the power of the watch, which the Comanche believed to contain a living spirit within its silver case. Akins' last words stuck with Lee, and shortly after their brief reunion, Akins was taken away never to be seen again. Lee's life in captivity stretched on, totaling 3 years with different Comanche tribes. Through each transfer, the watch held a revered status, regarded as a spiritual object by his captors. Following Akins' advice, Lee played the role of a compliant servant, performing various tasks for Big Wolf and later masters. Eventually, this approach earned him a degree of freedom within the camps at times. He was left unbound, even allowed to carry a knife. Big Wolf granted him the name Chamacacho, meaning the good white man, which Lee took as a blend of both honor and insult. Nonetheless, he worked to earn their trust, all the while planning his escape. Yet it wasn't without setbacks. A particularly harsh master-spotted leopard crippled him by slicing the muscle below his knee following a failed escape attempt. Other parts of his life were less dire. He even married a woman named Sleek Otter, whom he deemed attractive, though he turned down others whom he described as hideous or flabby. A thoughtless remark, perhaps, but indicative of his desire for survival. Eventually, with cunning and patience, Lee saw an opportunity for escape during a journey with his third master, Rolling Thunder ironically, on an expedition to meet other tribes about the threat of white encroachment on Comanche lands. Lee seized a hatchet a broad hand's breadth wide and buried it into Rolling Thunder's head. Grabbing the chief's rifle and knife, he mounted his horse and dashed away, charging toward what he hoped was freedom. Lee traveled southwest toward Chihuahua, guided by the sun during the day and the North Star at night. He navigated around natural barriers and stealthily evaded other Comanche, but as the days wore on, his health deteriorated. He wrote of his exhaustion and physical decay. Day by day, I grew weaker as I advanced. Often I prayed God that when I fell asleep, I might never wake up again. By the time his horse grew too weak to continue, he was alone, famished, and plagued with doubt. He even feared he might be losing his sanity. On the 56th day of his grueling escape, Lee rested in a prairie only to hear gunfire. Readying his rifle, he prepared for a final confrontation. But to his immense relief, he saw not Comanche but Mexican hunters, their sombreros unmistakable. These men, seeing Lee's desperation, took him in, offering water, food, and safe passage back to San Fernando, where he recuperated for 6 weeks under medical care. His ordeal was finally over, and in 1858 Nelson Lee returned to the East Coast, where he began chronicling his experiences. Reflecting on his trials, he wrote, "Although I would never forget the awful scenes of agony and torture I'd witnessed among them, the West and its dangers were for him left behind." This tale, in which Lee's survival balanced on audacity, cunning, and sheer will, is a profound account of human resilience and the extremes of cultural conflict on the American frontier.